So the definition then, and actually I'm not going to write all of this down. I'll put up a definition over my voice and you'll be reading that. Okay, so in Article 2 of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, it defines genocide as follows, right? Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. A. Killing members of the group. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its destruction in whole or in part. D. Imposing measures intending to prevent births within the group. E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So, in the definition of genocide, what we were just able to see is that the concept of genocide, as articulated within Article 2 of the UNGC, says that genocide, when we're talking about it, we technically, on a very technical level now, need to be able to understand what is it that we mean by genocide. So anytime we're talking about the idea of genocide, what we're saying is that genocide is the combination of specifically two things, right? Genocide is the combination of specifically two things. It is the combination of the intent and the act, right? And when we're talking about the acts that I just had up, acts A through E, right? So acts A through E. So if we have the intent, right, and by intent, what do we mean? We mean, as I stated, right, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, right? So this intent to destroy members of this group, right, the GENO, right, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, that intent to destroy in whole or in part is one aspect of the definition of genocide. The other aspect of the definition of genocide is the actual act, right? The actual act. Act A, B, C, D, E, and so on, right? So that when we're describing this, you can think of instances of genocide will obviously vary, right? You might have the intent plus Act A, the intent plus Act B, and so on and so on and so on and so on, right? So the intent plus any one of these five acts, acts A through E, constitutes genocide. There's a few more caveats that we need to address in order to have sort of a very clear understanding, I mean, at least introductory, for an introduction to genocide, a very clear understanding of what we mean by genocide when we're using the term genocide. In discussing genocide then, what we're attempting to say is that it's the intent plus the act. And it's pretty clear to understand what we mean by the act, right? We've gone through and given an example, for example, of forcibly transferring children from one group to another, which is Act E, right? So if I have the intent to forcibly transfer children from one group to another, and I actually forcibly transfer children from one group to another, with the intent of destroying this group by transferring the children, then I've committed an act of genocide. The question is, however, is that while we can sort of empirically verify the act, right, while we can have access to empirically verifying the act, it's very difficult to verify intent. I've done a discussion on what is acrosia. You can watch that video at your leisure to discuss sort of what we mean by acrosia. And the discussion of acrosia pertains in a small regard to this analysis, this brief analysis, and I'm not going to complicate it, of genocide, because in discussing acrosia, it's the association between intent and action. In discussing genocide, it's the association, similarly, between an intent and action. So what is the relationship between this intent and this act? The act is easy to identify. It's empirically verifiable, right? You can go and count the number of people that were forcibly transferred. You can go and count or approximate the number of people that were slaughtered and exterminated, and so on. What's more difficult to identify is the intent. How do we come to identify intent? Well, with respect to this idea of intent, it's important to recognize how we're going to classify intent in the discussion of genocide. Specifically, when we're talking about intent, we're talking about the technical term dolus specialis, right? Specific intent, and I'll write this down in a second. And the way that we assess dolus specialis, right, the specific intent, is that we deduce the intent from the action, right? You look at the action, and based on the actions, we're going to make deductions on what we think might have motivated the individual, right? Because of these acts, what must have happened, right? What must have been the individual's motivation or goal? In later discussions, I'm going to make distinctions between motivation and intention. I'm not going to do that now. There's not necessarily a hot debate in genocide scholarship, but it's sort of contested, the distinction between motivation and intention. I come from the school of thought that motivation and intention are two separate categories. There are others that argue that they're not. I get this argument in part from a scholar, Shabazz, who makes this distinction. I'm not going to get into all of that right now. Okay, so what do we mean by intent? Well, by intent, as I said, I'm talking about a very specific type of intent, and it's called dolus, D-O-L-U-S, specialis, S-P-E-C-I-A-L-I-S, right? Dolus specialis, and this is specific intent, S-P-E-C. Alright, this is specific intent. When we're talking about dolus specialis, specific intent, we're going to try and deduce the intent from the act, right? We're going to try and make sort of this logical deduction on what must have been the intent, right? Based on the act that was present, right? We need to be able to recognize then, for example, if I see an instance of systematic, not just, sort of incidental, right? That's important, right? It's not just an incidental, and I'm just going to use the last example, E, an incidental forced transference of a child or two, right? But the systematic, sort of deliberate, diligent transference of children from one group to another. And the reason that is being done is because we want to effectively kill off the next generation of that particular ethnic group or racial group or what have you. Well then, based on the action, I'm able to make the basic logical conclusion. I'm able to draw this conclusion that, well, what are people attempting to do? They're attempting to destroy the group, right? Not only are they attempting to destroy the group, but here's proof that they're attempting to destroy the group. That sort of pointing to proof, coupled with the intent plus the act, gives me, and this me being, this would particularly be lawyers, would give lawyers enough proof to warrant the act as an act of genocide. It's important then to understand that you cannot have the classification of genocide where there's only the intent. Nor can you have the classification of genocide where there's only the act. It is only when the intent is coupled with the act that you are warranted, sort of legally and conceptually, in attributing the term genocide. Now, even this is still under debate. This is still ongoing. For example, if I have the intent to forcibly transfer children from one group to another group, right, as expressed in E of Article 2 of the UNGC, but I don't do it, well, I haven't committed genocide, and that's sort of obvious, right? If it happens to be the case that children are forcibly transferred from one group to another, but it's not possible to show, or the prosecution, for example, fails to show that that act was done with a specific intent to destroy. Let's say some children were left behind and weren't transferred. Other children may have been targeted, selected, and those children were transferred. Well, you will arguably have a crime, no one's contesting that, but to label that crime as an act of genocide, it would fail because you failed to prove specific intent, dolus specialis. Now there's lots of complications with specific intent, lots of debate with specific intent. I myself am examining this concept of specific intent, but I'm not going to go into that analysis now.